good's hour. I have not been as others were. I have not seen as others saw. I could not bring my passions from a common spring. From the same source I have not taken. My sorrow I could not awaken. My heart to joy at the same tone. And all I loved alone. In the poem, Alone, and many other writings, Edgar Allan Poe could articulate the perception of the loner and outcast, those who battle personal demons or suffer some external haunting, and even a view through the eyes of the truly disturbed, violent, and morbid. But does his ability to do this with such detail and ease cause us to assume such darkness lived within the author himself? Was Poe so dark and disturbed? What horror must he have endured in his youth to conjure such depravity into the pages of his poetry and stories? From his birth to his final words, Edgar Allan Poe's life was shrouded in mystery. Born on January 19, 1809 in Boston, Massachusetts, to actors David and Elizabeth Poe, Edgar faced abandonment and loss early. His father left when he was just 2, and his mother died shortly after. Orphaned, he was taken in by the wealthy Allan family of Richmond, Virginia, who gave him their surname as his middle name. Despite the comfort of his new home, Poe never truly felt at ease with the Allans. His foster father was distant and disapproving, particularly of Edgar's literary aspirations. This strained relationship, coupled with ongoing personal struggles with mania, alcoholism, and addiction, eventually led to his tragic demise. But is this the full truth? What does further evidence show about Edgar Allan Poe, the man behind the macabre? Where did the tales surrounding this master storyteller originate? This presentation is not intended to be a scholarly dissertation. I am no literary academic, but rather a lifelong admirer of Poe. Ever since discovering his poems and short stories in high school, his works have profoundly inspired my own creativity in writing and music. Now, many years later, I'm delving deeper into the enigma of Edgar Allan Poe, not merely as a writer, but as a man. Through this journey, I began to question, have we misunderstood Poe? Have we traded the truth of his humanity, his struggles, triumphs, and vulnerabilities for a more convenient, mythical image? Beyond the horror stories he is famous for, Poe also wrote a number of satires, humor tales, and hoaxes. He was a master of sarcasm. For comic effect, he often used irony and ludicrous extravagance in a deliberate attempt to liberate the reader from cultural and literary conformity. Moreover, could there have been influential figures in Poe's time who sought to tarnish his reputation, engaging in slander, theft, and misrepresentation of his intellectual property? These acts may have shaped the narrative perpetuated by biographers, some of whose accounts are still regarded as authoritative today. Let's sift through fact and fiction, lore and history, to better understand the man and his legacy. According to the Edgar Allan Poe Society of Baltimore website, in their article, Edgar Allan Poe's Problematic Biography, For over 150 years, legions of scholars, literary people, journalists, and general Poe devotees have tried to capture Edgar Allan Poe's complex personality and enshrine it forever in paper and ink. They have exhaustively chased every conceivable source to fill in the details of his life. Every person who met Poe, or was willing to claim so, and was still alive after 1875, was coerced to recall any scrap of fact or insight, no matter how trivial or vague. After these people had passed on, their children and even grandchildren were asked to repeat anything they heard about Poe. From this mass of disjointed and often contradictory information, Poe's biography has been crafted, each generation relying heavily on the work of prior biographers, themselves often happy to steal from their competitors without so much as a footnote. Every letter he wrote, every note he jotted on a piece of paper, every photograph, every newspaper or magazine article, every building, stick of wood, or piece of bric-a-brac with a Poe association was duly collected, cataloged, and interpreted. But Poe himself has fooled us all and remains to this day an elusive quarry. On the matter of Poe's birth, the article continues. In Poe's case, there's a great deal of information, but very few verifiable facts. Everything about him is controversial, literally from the place and date of his birth to the exact location and date of his burial. There is no birth certificate, and although Poe seems to have known that he was born in Boston in 1809, most biographies claimed until 1880 that he was born in Baltimore in 1811. Poe himself once even gave 1813 as the date, 2 years after his mother's death. It is worth noting, not only was there no birth certificate for Poe, there's also no death certificate, medical records, or accurately recorded location of his actual burial site. David Poe Jr. was born in Baltimore, Maryland. His father, David Poe Sr., was known for his patriotic self-sacrifice during the American Revolution. David Jr. defied his family's wishes to become a lawyer, instead opting to become an actor. He fell in love with and married Elizabeth Arnold Hopkins, whose husband, Charles Hopkins, had died 6 months before. David Poe Jr. was considered an inferior actor compared to his wife. One critic said of Eliza and David, "The young lady was young and pretty, and evinced talent both as a singer and actress. The gentleman was literally nothing." After the birth of their second son, Edgar, the Poe family ran low on money, and David Poe Jr. is assumed to have abandoned his family and disappeared from record. It is not known whether he left in search of employment in another city or, as some authors have speculated, a separation due to his wife's infidelity. In his absence, Elizabeth gave birth to a third child, a daughter named Rosalie, which may have fueled some of the infidelity rumors. According to author Susan Archer Talley-Wise, David Poe Jr. reportedly died on December 11, 1811, only 3 days after Eliza's death. Elizabeth Arnold was born to Henry and Elizabeth Arnold in London in the spring of 1787. Her mother was a stage actress in London from 1791 to 1795. Her father Henry is thought to have died in 1790. In November 1795, Eliza and her mother sailed from England to Boston, Massachusetts, where they arrived on January 3, 1796. In Boston, young Elizabeth debuted on stage at the age of just 9 years old, only 3 months after she arrived in the United States. Later, Eliza's mother married musician Charles Tubbs, who had sailed with them from England. The small family joined with a manager named Mr. Edgar to form a theater troupe called the Charleston Comedians. Elizabeth, Eliza's mother, died sometime while this troupe was traveling through North Carolina. Little is known about her death, but she disappears from theatrical records in 1798 and is presumed she died shortly after. In the summer of 1802, a 15-year-old Eliza marries Charles Hopkins. Hopkins died 3 years later in October 1805, possibly of yellow fever, leaving Eliza an 18-year-old widow. The Baltimore-born David Poe Jr. saw Eliza performing in Norfolk, Virginia, and decided to join her acting troupe, abandoning his family's plans for him to study law. Poe married Eliza only 6 months after Charles Hopkins died in 1806. The couple traveled throughout New England and the rest of the Northeast, playing in various towns such as Richmond and Philadelphia, and at an outdoor summer theater in New York City before finally settling in Boston. They stayed in Boston for 3 consecutive seasons of 30 weeks each in a theater that fit an audience of about 1,000. Reviews at the time often remarked of Eliza's interesting figure and sweet, melodious voice. Though times were difficult, the couple had 2 sons. William Henry Leonard was born in January 1807, 9 months after their wedding, and Edgar was born January 19, 1809, at a boarding house near Boston Common, close to where the troupe was performing. Eliza performed until 10 days before Edgar's birth, and may have named her second son after Mr. Edgar, who led the Charleston Comedians. On Sunday morning, December 8, 1811, at the tender age of 24, surrounded by her children, Eliza Poe passed. It is generally assumed that the cause of death was tuberculosis. After her death, her 3 children were split up. The oldest, Henry, lived with a family in Baltimore, Maryland, while Edgar and Rosalie were cared for by 2 different families in Richmond, Virginia. He became a professional sailor on the USS Macedonian, which took him to the West Indies, the Mediterranean, and Russia. After a short, unsuccessful career as a law clerk, he began publishing poems in 1827, as well as a short story, The Pirate, a fictionalized account of his brother, Edgar's, first relationship with Sarah Elmira Royster in Richmond. Henry, who was a heavy drinker and may have been an alcoholic, died of tuberculosis on October 1, 1831, in Baltimore, likely in the same room or even the same bed he shared with his brother Edgar. He was 24. Henry was buried at what is now Westminster Hall and Burying Ground, where his brother would be buried several years later. Henry's obituary misspelled his name as W.H. Hope. Rosalie, sister of Edgar Allan Poe, is said to have been born in December of 1810, but we have no solid documentary evidence for this assertion. All we know for certain is that she was born long enough after the disappearance of her mother, Eliza's husband, for questions to arise about the girl's paternity. It was even said in later years that David's sister and Edgar's mother-in-law, Maria Clem, claimed that Rosalie was not the child of either Eliza or David Poe. Intriguingly, when Rosalie was a child, a wealthy resident of Richmond, Virginia, Joseph Gallego, died and left a will bequeathing Rosalie the then enormous sum of $2,000 for her maintenance. She was the only charity bequeathed in his will to be so favored, leaving one to speculate whether the small orphan was more than just an object of sympathy. After Eliza Poe died in 1811, Rosalie was given a home by the Mackenzies, a prominent Richmond family. But there's conflicting evidence about whether she was treated as a member of the family or merely a ward. Rosalie seems to have had a distant, if not antagonistic, relationship with her famous older brother. She claimed that she was a good-sized girl before she even knew she had a sibling, an incredible statement considering they were raised in the same city. Edgar's one-time fiancée, Sarah Helen Whitman, stated that he told her his relationship with Rosalie was characterized by coldness and estrangement. Considering that Rosalie is generally characterized as having a childlike mentality and an off-putting personality, Whitman likely spoke the truth. Rosalie appears to have led a relatively comfortable and stable existence in the Mackenzie home until the Civil War left the family destitute. Thereafter, her story becomes a pure, pitiable tragedy. The remaining members of her foster family sent her to Poe relatives in Baltimore. As her kin wanted little to do with her, she was soon left on her resources, a fate her intelligence, character, and upbringing left her completely unable to handle. She made attempts to gain work as a housekeeper and was said to walk the streets trying to sell pictures of Edgar to passers-by, but her main source of support was the kindness of strangers, motivated to assist her by her admiration for her legendary sibling. Rosalie spent her last few years in a charity home in Washington, D.C. Her burial was arranged by Edgar Poe fans who, curiously, gave her a tombstone giving her a year of birth as 1812, the year after Eliza Poe's death. In a letter, an adult Edgar himself wrote of the circumstances surrounding his birth and childhood as he understood in this way. My father David died when I was in the second year of my age and when my sister Rosalie was an infant in arms. Our mother died a few weeks before him. Thus we were left orphans at an age when the hand is so peculiarly requisite. At this time period, my grandfather's circumstances were at a low ebb, he from great wealth having been reduced to poverty. It was therefore in his power to do little for us. My brother Henry he took, however, under his charge, while myself and Rosalie were adopted by gentlemen in Richmond, where we were at the period of our parents' death. I was adopted by Mr. John Allen of Richmond, Virginia, and she by Mr. William Mackenzie of the same place. Rosalie is still living at Mr. McKay's, still unmarried, and is treated as one of the family, being a favorite with all. I accompanied Mr. Allen to England in my 7th year and remained there at school 5 years, since which I resided with Mr. A until a few years ago. The first Mrs. A having died and Mr. A having married again, I found my situation not so comfortable as before and obtained a cadet's appointment at West Point. During my stay there, Mr. A died suddenly and left me nothing. No will was found among his papers. I have accordingly been thrown entirely upon my own resources, brought up to no profession, and educated in the expectation of an immense fortune, Mr. A having been worth $750,000. The blow has been a heavy one, and I had nearly succumbed to its influence and yielded to despair. But by the exertion of much resolution, I am now beginning to look upon the matter in a less serious light, and although struggling still with many embarrassments, am enabled to keep up my spirits. I have lately obtained the editorship of the Southern Messenger and may probably yet do well. Edgar Poe was taken into the home of John Allen, a successful merchant in Richmond, Virginia, who dealt in a variety of goods like cloth, wheat, tombstones, and tobacco. The Allens served as a foster family and gave him the name Edgar Allan Poe, although they never formally adopted him. In March 1825, Allen's uncle William Galt died. He was said to be one of the wealthiest men in Richmond, leaving John Allen several acres of real estate. The inheritance was estimated at $750,000, equivalent to approximately $20 million as of 2024. Some have said that John Allen was equally spoiling Edgar as he was harsh, while Mrs. Allen seemed to have a very special bond with Poe. As Edgar entered his teenage years, however, bad feelings developed between him and John Allan. Allan disapproved of Edgar's ambition to become a writer, thought he was ungrateful, and seems to have decided to cut Poe out of his will, frustrated with Edgar's irresponsible behavior. He also viewed Poe as a disappointment in having decided not to pursue Allan's hopes for him of an education and career as a lawyer. Poe may have become engaged to a young Sarah Elmira Royster before he registered at the University of Virginia in February 1826 to study ancient and modern languages. The university was in its infancy, established on the ideals of its founder, Thomas Jefferson. It had strict rules against gambling, horses, guns, tobacco, and alcohol, but these rules were mostly ignored. Jefferson enacted a system of student self-government, allowing students to choose their studies, make their arrangements for boarding, and report all wrongdoing to the faculty. The unique system was rather chaotic, and there was a high dropout rate. Just months after Poe began his attendance at the university, a controversy erupted into violence on the campus. Henry Dixon and his brother Turner enrolled in the spring of 1826, the university's second session. That May, a quarrel with fellow student Arthur Smith turned violent. After Dixon aimed a blow at Smith's head, Smith drew his pistol and pulled the trigger. The gun, however, failed to discharge. The faculty suspended Dixon until July 1st, 1826, although they allowed him to return for the next session that fall. In November, the faculty voted to expel Dixon because he absented himself from the university without permission. Dixon, they discovered, left the grounds to fight a duel with fellow student Livingston Lindsay. Poe himself wrote of the disturbance in more detail in a letter to John Allan, writing in May 1826. Dear Sir, I this morning received the clothes you sent me and the uniform coat, 6 yards of striped cloth for pantaloons, and 4 pair of socks. The coat is a beautiful one and fits me exactly. I thought it best not to write till I received the clothes, or I should have written before this. You have heard, no doubt, of the disturbances in college. Soon after you left here, the grand jury met and put the students in a terrible fright, so much so that the lectures were unattended, and those whose names were upon the sheriff's list traveled off into the woods and mountains, taking their beds and provisions along with them. There were about 50 on the list, so you may suppose the college was very well thinned. This was the first day of the fright. The second day, a proclamation was issued by the faculty forbidding any student under pain of a major punishment to leave his dormitory between the hours of 8 and 10 a.m., at which time the sheriffs would be about, or in any way to resist the lawful authority of the sheriffs. This order, however, was very little attended to, as the fear of the faculty could not counterbalance that of the grand jury. Most of the indicted ran off a second time into the woods, and upon an examination the next morning by the faculty, some were reprimanded, some suspended, and one expelled. James Albert Clark from Manchester, I went to school with him at Berks, was suspended for 2 months. Armstead Carter from this neighborhood for the remainder of the session, and Thomas Barclay forever. There have been several fights since you were here. One between Turner Dixon and Blow from Norfolk excited more interest than I have ever seen, for a common fight is so trifling an occurrence that no notice is taken of it. Blow got much the advantage in the scuffle, but Dixon posted him in very indecent terms, upon which the whole Norfolk party rose in arms, and nothing was talked off for a week but Dixon's charge and Blow's explanation. Every pillar in the university was white with scratched paper. Dixon made a physical attack upon Arthur Smith, one of Blow's Norfolk friends, and a very fine fellow. He struck him with a large stone on one side of his head, whereupon Smith drew a pistol, which are all the fashion here, and had it not misfired, he would have put an end to the controversy. But so it was, it did misfire, and the matter has since been more peaceably settled, as the proctor engaged a magistrate to bind the whole forces on both sides over to the peace. Give my love to Ma and Miss Nancy and all my friends. I remain yours, affectionately, Edgar. Will you be so good as to send me a copy of History of Tacitus? It is a small volume, also somewhere so. During his time at the University of Virginia, Poe lost touch with Royster, and he also became estranged from his foster father over gambling debts. In 8 months, he lost $2,000. He claimed that Allan had not given him sufficient money to register for classes, purchase text, and pay dormitory fees. Allan did send additional money and clothes, but Poe's debts increased. One student recalled Poe saying he intended to see how fast he could spend the old man's money. As Poe mentioned, the inheritance left to Mr. Allan on several occasions when requesting funds from his foster father. Poe seemed to have already decided to claim the inheritance in his imagination and live the part in his reality, racking up both gambling debts and debts to the university. Allan's refusal to help him led to a final break between the two, and in March 1827, Poe gave up on the university after a year. He did not feel welcome to return to Richmond, especially when he learned that his sweetheart Royster had married another man, Alexander Shelton. Poe had been writing to her while he was at the university, but her father had intercepted the letters. Only one is said to have reached her. He traveled to Boston in April 1827, sustaining himself with odd jobs as a clerk and newspaper contributor. Poe started using the pseudonym Henry Le Rene during this period in order to save himself from being arrested on a debtor's warrant and to conceal his departure. On May 26, 1827, already a published poet and finding himself in serious debt and poverty, Edgar Allan Poe enlisted in the United States Army as Edgar A. Perry at the age of 18, lying on the application stating that he was 22. Poe was promoted to Sergeant Major on the 1st of January, 1829. When forced to reveal his real name and his actual circumstances to his commanding officer, Lieutenant Howard, he promised to allow Poe to be honorably discharged if he reconciled with Allan. Poe then wrote a letter to Allan, who was unsympathetic and spent several months ignoring Poe's pleas. It is commonly assumed that Allan may have purposely delayed informing Poe of his foster mother's illness as an act of spite. Frances Allan died on February 28, 1829, intending to be with her in her ailment, but having received the news of her illness too late, Poe arrived the day after her burial. John Allan eventually agreed to support Poe's desire to join the United States Military Academy at West Point, New York. Poe was discharged from the Army on April 15, 1829. Before entering West Point, he moved to Baltimore, where he stayed with his widowed aunt, Maria Clem, her daughter, Virginia Eliza Clem, Poe's first cousin, his brother Henry, and his invalid grandmother, Elizabeth Cairns Poe. Poe traveled to West Point on July 1, 1830. In October 1830, John Allan married his second wife, Louisa Patterson. This marriage and the bitter quarrels with Poe over children born to Allan out of extramarital affairs led to Allan finally disowning Poe and leaving him out of his will when he later died in 1834, leaving nothing of his fortune to Edgar and only to the children of his second wife. Poe then decided to leave West Point by intentionally getting court-martialed. On February 8, 1831, Edgar Allan Poe was tried for gross neglect of duty and disobedience of orders for refusing to attend formations, classes, and church. Knowing he would be found guilty, Poe pleaded not guilty to the charges to induce dismissal. Fellow West Point cadet and friend Thomas W. Gibson reminisced upon Poe's humor and antics in an 1867 issue of Harper's New Monthly Magazine. The first conversation I had with Poe after we became enlisted as roommates was characteristic of the man, a volume of Thomas Campbell's poems was lying upon my table, and he tossed it contemptuously aside with the curt remark, "Campbell is a plagiarist." Then, without waiting for a reply, he picked up the book and turned the leaves over rapidly until he found the passage he was looking for. "There," said he, "is a line more often quoted than any other passage of his. Like angel visits few and far between." And he stole it bodily from Robert Blair's The Grave. Not satisfied with the theft, he has spoiled it in the effort to disguise it. Blair wrote, "Like angel visits short and far between." Campbell's "few and far between" is mere tautology. Poe at that time, though only about 20 years of age, had the appearance of being much older. He had a worn, weary, discontented look, not easily forgotten by those who were intimate with him. Poe was easily fretted by any jest at his expense, and was not a little annoyed by a story that some of the class got up to the effect that he had procured a cadet's appointment for his son, and the boy having died, the father has substituted himself in his place. Another report current in the court was that he was a grandson of Benedict Arnold. Some good-natured friend told him of it, and Poe did not contradict it, but seemed rather pleased than otherwise at the mistake. Very early in his brief career at the Point, he established a high reputation for genius, and poems and squibs of local interest were daily issued from number 28 and went the round of the classes. One of the first things of the kind that he perpetrated was a diatribe in which all of the officers of the Academy, from Colonel Sylvanus Thayer down, were duly, if not favorably, noticed. I can recall but one stanza. It ran thus: "John Locke was a very great name. Joe Locke was a greater in short. The former was well known to fame, the latter well known to report." Joe Locke, it may be remarked by way of explanation, was one of the instructors of tactics, an ex officio inspector of barracks, and supervisor of the morals and deportment of cadets generally. In this capacity, it was his duty to report to headquarters every violation of the regulations falling under his observation, a duty in which he was nowise remiss, as the occupants of number 28 could severely testify. The studies of the Academy Poe utterly ignored. I doubt if he ever studied a page of LaCroix, unless it was to glance hastily over it in the lecture room, while others of his section were reciting. It was evident from the first that he had no intention of going through with the course. He continues in this article with a lengthy yet highly insightful look into a young 20-year-old Poe. Alone and having already lost some of the most important people in his life, whether by death or disagreement, Poe was still, like many young men at that age, entertained by frightening or spooking friends, playing pranks, and generally being gross little boys transitioning into vulgar-humored young men. Mr. Gibson gives us a real-life tale of the younger Poe that seems as if one of his own stories had jumped off the pages and played out with Poe living as a main supporting character. The unfortunate habit that proved the bane of his afterlife had even at that time taken strong hold upon him. In number 28, their barracks number, was seldom without a bottle of Benny Haven's best brandy. I don't think he was ever intoxicated while at the Academy, but he had already acquired the more dangerous habit of constant drinking. Keeping up the communications with our base of supplies at Old Benny's was one of the problems that occupied a good deal more of our thoughts than any of the propositions of Legendre, but upon the whole, this branch of the commissary department of number 28 was a success, and many a thirsty soul with not enough of pluck to run the blockade himself would steal into our room between tattoo and taps to try the merits of the last importation. The result of one of these foraging parties after supplies created for a time no little excitement in the South Barracks. People had been burned and hung in effigy from time immemorial. but it was reserved for number 28 to witness the eating of a professor in effigy. It was a dark, cold, drizzling night in the last days of November when this event came off. The brandy bottle had been empty for 2 days, and just at dusk, Poe proposed that we should draw straws, the one who drew the shortest to go down to the old Benny's and replenish our stock. The straws were drawn, and the lot fell on me. Provided with our 4 pounds of candles and Poe's last blanket for traffic, silver and gold we had not, but such as we had we gave unto Benny. I started just as the bugle sounded to quarters. It was a rough road to travel, but I knew every foot of it by night or day, and reached my place of destination in safety, but drenched to the skin. Old Benny was not in the best of humors that evening. Candles and blankets and regulation shoes and similar articles of traffic had accumulated largely on his hands, and the market for them was dull in that neighborhood. His chicken suppers and bottles of brandy had disappeared very rapidly of late, and he had received little or no money in return. At last, however, I succeeded in exchanging the candles and blanket for a bottle of brandy and the hardest-featured, loudest-voiced old gander that it has ever been in my lot to encounter. To chop the bird's head off before venturing into barracks with him was a matter of pure necessity, and thus, in fact, old Benny rendered him before delivery. I reached the suburbs of the barracks about 9 o'clock. The bottle had not as much brandy in it when I left old Benny's, but I was very confident that I had not spilled any. I'd carried the gander first over one shoulder and then over the other, and the consequence was that not only my shirt front, but my face and hands were as bloody as the entire contents of the old gander's veins and arteries could well make them. Poe was on the lookout and met me some distance from the barracks, and my appearance at once inspired him with the idea of a grand hoax. Our plans were perfected in an instant. The gander was tied neck and feet and wings together, and the bloody feathers bristling in every direction gave it a nondescript appearance that would have defied recognition as a gander by the most astute naturalist on the continent. Poe took charge of the bottle and preceded me to the room. Old P was puzzling his brains over the binomial theorem, and a visitor from the North Barracks was in the room awaiting the result of my expedition. Poe had taken his seat and pretended to be absorbed in the mysteries of Le Conte Français. Laying the gander down at the outside of the door, I walked, or rather staggered, into the room, pretending to be very drunk and exhibiting in clothes and face a spectacle not often seen off the stage. "My God, what has happened?" exclaimed Poe with well-acted horror. Okay, I repeated several times and with gestures intended to be particularly savage. "Well, what of him?" asked Poe. "He won't stop me on the road anymore," and I produced a large knife that we had stained with the few drops of blood that remained in the old gander. "I have killed him." "Nonsense," said Poe. "You're only trying one of your tricks on us." "I didn't suppose you would believe me," I replied, so I cut off his head and brought it into barracks. "Here it is." And reaching out of the door, I caught the gander by the legs and giving it one fearful swing around my head, dashed it at the only candle in the room and left them all in darkness with what 2 of them believed to be the head of one of the professors. The visitor leaped through the window and alighted in the slop tub and made fast time for his own room in the North Barracks, spreading as he went the report that I had killed old K and that his head was then in number 28. The story gained ready credence, and for a time the excitement in the barracks ran high. When we lit the candle again, old P was sitting in one corner, a blank picture of horror, and was some time before we could restore him to reason. The gander was skinned. Picking the feathers off was out of the question, and after taps we cut him up in small pieces and cooked him in a tin wash basin over an anthracite fire, without seasoning of any kind. It was perhaps the hardest supper on record, but we went through with it without flinching. We had set out to eat old K in effigy, and we did it. Whether he ever learned of the honors we paid him that night, I never learned. Upon On the whole, impression left by Poe in his short career at West Point was highly favorable to him. If he made no fast friends, he left no enemies behind him. But up to that time, he had given no indications of the genius which has since secured for him a worldwide fame. His acquaintance with English literature was extensive and accurate, and his verbal memory wonderful. He would repeat both prose and poetry by the hour, and seldom or never repeated the same passage twice to the same audience. In 1883, Poe received a prize for his MS found in a bottle, and his friend John Pendleton Kennedy, a lawyer and writer, got him a job at the Southern Literary Messenger. In 1836, Poe married his cousin Virginia, now 13 years old, and he 27, and moved to Richmond with her and her mother, his aunt, Maria Clem. It is believed that excessive drinking caused him to lose his job with the Messenger in 1837. He had written 83 reviews, 6 poems, 4 essays, and 3 short stories for the journal. He had also greatly increased its sales. Losing this job was extremely distressing to him and his state of mind from then on. Poe moved with Virginia and her mother to New York City, where he published his only long work of fiction, the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, in 1838. They then moved to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where Poe served as co-editor of Burton's Gentleman's Magazine. Poe left Burton's after a year and found a position as a writer and co-editor at Graham's Magazine, which was a successful monthly publication. On February 20th, 1841, the Saturday Evening Post, Philadelphia, announced that Poe had become an editor for Graham's Magazine, beginning with the April issue. In April 1841, Graham's Magazine featured Poe's Murders in the Rue Morgue, the first modern detective story.
Dr. Miracle in the Rue Morgue is guilty of 4 murders so far this week, and by now perhaps a 5th.
This story would be the inspiration for the character novels of Sherlock Holmes by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. The first published Sherlock Holmes contains a subtle nod from Holmes to C. Auguste Dupin, Poe's detective in Murders in the Rue Morgue. In the story, Dr. Watson compares Holmes to Dupin, and Holmes responds, "In my opinion, Dupin was a very inferior fellow." Arthur Conan Doyle once said that Edgar Allan Poe's stories were a model for all time. During Poe's tenure, the circulation of Graham's Magazine increased from about 5,000 to nearly 37,000 subscribers, making it far and away the most popular periodical of its day. During Charles Dickens' tour of America in the spring of 1842, Poe and Charles Dickens arranged to meet while he is in Philadelphia. Dickens agrees to consider writing for Graham's and to try to find an English publisher for Poe's Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque, although nothing will ever come of either promise. In May 1842, Poe leaves the editorship of Graham's magazine. He is replaced by Rufus W. Griswold. In a letter to his friend F.W. Thomas, Poe notes, "The report of my having parted with Graham is correct, although in the forthcoming June number there is no announcement to that effect, nor had the papers any authority for the statement made. My duties ceased with the May number. I shall continue to contribute occasionally. My reason for resigning was discussed with the namby-pamby character of the magazine, a character which it was impossible to eradicate. I allude to the contemptible pictures, fashion plates, music, and love tales. The salary, moreover, did not pay me for the labor which I was forced to bestow. With Graham, who is really a very gentlemanly, although exceedingly weak man, I had no misunderstanding." In November of 1843, Poe delivers the first of his lectures on American poetry, beginning in Philadelphia. The large audience overflows the hall, and reviews are generally favorable, inspiring Poe to proceed with other performances of the lecture. Among Poe's later lectures are The Poets and Poetry of America, The Poetic Principle, and The Universe, which became the basis for his 1848 book, Eureka. In late 1844, Poe is offered a job by George Pope Morris and Nathaniel Parker Willis as part of the staff of the Evening Mirror in New York. In 1849, Willis said of Poe, "Mr. Poe was employed by us for several months as critic and sub-editor. This was our first personal acquaintance with him. He resided with his wife and mother at Fordham, a few miles out of town, but was at his desk in the office from 9 in the morning till the evening paper went to press. He was invariably punctual and industrious." On January 29, 1845, Poe's poem The Raven appeared in the Evening Mirror and quickly became a popular sensation. It made Poe a household name almost instantly, though at the time he was only paid $9, equivalent to $294 in 2024, for its publication. Just a month later, in February, Poe became an editor of the Broadway Journal. By July 12th, he is the sole editor, and by October 24th, the sole owner as well. Poe finally has full control of a magazine. Unfortunately, one already laboring perilously under serious debts. The Broadway Journal failed in 1846, and Poe then moved his family to a cottage in Fordham, New York, in the Bronx. That home, now known as the Edgar Allan Poe Cottage, was relocated in later years to a park. Virginia died at the cottage on January 30th, 1847. Biographers and critics often suggest that Poe's frequent theme of the death of a beautiful woman stems from the repeated loss of women throughout his life, including his wife. Poe was increasingly unstable after his wife's death. He attempted to court the poet Sarah Helen Whitman, who lived in Providence, Rhode Island. Their engagement failed purportedly because of Poe's drinking and erratic behavior. There is also strong evidence that Whitman's mother intervened and did much to derail the relationship. Poe returns to Richmond and meets with the now widowed Elmira Royster Shelton. Rekindling the youthful romance, Poe asks her to marry him. Miss Shelton is instantly hesitant, but by August 25th has accepted Poe's proposal. By remarrying, Miss Shelton would have had to give up a large portion of the inheritance left by her husband as stipulated in his will. To the dismay of her children, she and Poe once again became engaged in 1849. Poe planned to move permanently to Richmond to be with Elmira. He planned a trip to New York to bring Maria, his mother-in-law, back to Richmond. He was also planning to see a client in Philadelphia on the way up the coast. Again, according to the Poe Museum website, Poe's last day in Richmond was on September 26, 1849. Elmira was worried about his health. After his bout of cholera, his health had been quite fragile. She encouraged Poe to visit his doctor, who is also a friend. Poe did, but it was primarily a social visit. He had a late meal at Sadler's Restaurant, and at 4 a.m. on September 27, 1849, Poe boarded a ship headed for Baltimore. From September 27th until October 3rd, there is no record of his whereabouts. The Edgar Allan Poe Society of Baltimore says, "The exact details of Poe's condition and treatment here are left to us only in the writings of his attending physician, Dr. John J. Moran. Unfortunately, Dr. Moran, who seems to have given up medicine after 1851 and was briefly the mayor of Falls Church, Virginia, appears to have made quite a career from 1875 until his own death in 1888, lecturing on Poe's final days, the story growing more elaborate and intriguing with each telling. Thus, what should have been the best source is actually one of the least reliable. Poe's cousin, Nielsen Poe, tried to visit on October 6th, but was told that Edgar was too excitable and left without seeing him. Since Moran's testimony is all we have, therefore, we must be satisfied with it. With that caveat, the following information is an attempt to provide a relatively cohesive summary based on Moran's various and often contradictory accounts. Their summary was as follows. Poe was taken to a room in one of the towers where persons ill from drinking were usually put to avoid disturbing the other patients. Moran quickly decided, however, though, that Poe was not drunk and indeed had not been drinking. Since Poe's clothing had been taken and replaced with something much more worn and garish, Moran suspected that Poe may have been robbed and mugged. Poe came in and out of consciousness, at one point refusing a glass of brandy offered as a stimulant. Moran then has Poe giving a number of absurdly flowery speeches, including "Language cannot tell the gushing well that swells, sways and sweeps, tempest-like over me, signaling the alarm of death." When asked about his friends, Poe supposedly replied that "my best friend would be the man who gave me a pistol that I might blow out my brains." By one of Moran's descriptions, Poe called out the name of Reynolds, who has never satisfactorily been identified. At around 5 in the morning on Sunday, October 7th, Poe died. His last words may have been, "Lord help my poor soul." All of the relevant medical records have been lost, including Poe's death certificate. Moran's description of the cause of Poe's death is vague in that he probably did not know precisely what had happened to his patient. He was apparently unaware of the fact that Poe had been diagnosed sometime earlier with cholera, a weak heart, and that another physician said that he had lesions on the brain. The only official cause of death noted at the time comes from the Baltimore Clipper as congestion of the brain. The doctor labeled his cause of death as phrenitis, inflammation of the brain, which was commonly used when the true cause of death was unknown. The Edgar Allan Poe Society of Baltimore. His death has been a subject of speculation for over a century. Some believe he died from complications of alcoholism, others suggest rabies, while some even speculated he was the victim of a political kidnapping, a practice known as cooping, where individuals were forcibly made to vote multiple times in elections. His cause of death remains unknown, but one thing is certain: Poe's life was tragically short and marked by suffering. All medical records and documents, including Poe's death certificate, have been lost, if they ever existed. The precise cause of Poe's death is disputed, but many theories exist. Many biographers have addressed the issue and reached different conclusions, ranging from Jeffrey Myers's assertion that it was hypoglycemia to a John Evangelist Welsh's conspiratorial murder plot theory. It has also been suggested that Poe's death might have resulted from suicide related to depression. In 1848, he nearly died from an overdose of laudanum, readily available as a tranquilizer and painkiller, though it is unclear if this was a true suicide attempt or just a miscalculation of dosage on Poe's part. It did not lead to Poe's death. We're talking about a time in history in which the scientific and medical advancements had drugs that we now see as the cause of suffering in an epidemic. Heroin was initially marketed as a cough suppressant. Heroin was given to children to treat coughs. Morphine was first marketed in 1827 and was used to control pain derived from opium. Opium, an addictive drug made from the juice of the opium poppy plant, was used to treat various conditions such as sleeplessness, fever, headache, cough, bladder inflammation, diarrhea, and nervous disorders. Laudanum, a tincture of opium prepared by adding powdered opium to alcohol, was also widely prescribed. It was as available and common for all levels of pain relief as Tylenol in the modern era. In 2020, a psychological analysis of Poe's language theorized that he was suffering from a major depressive episode near the end of his life and that suicide could not be ruled out. However, the evidence for suicide was not consistently present in Poe's professional writings, leading the researchers to conclude that depression may have played a role in his death, but suicide seemed unlikely. Writing, "From our analysis, we can conclude that Poe's final months were indeed quite dark. This was primarily evident with his personal life. For example, Poe's personal letter that scored highest on our depression index was one written to his mother-in-law in July 1849, where he wrote about the poor state of his health, finances, and clothes. Although our analysis revealed that Poe was spiraling into a depression at the end of his life, we can't say for sure whether his death was a suicide, considering his rather high suicide risk from a clinical perspective. Paired with our objective analysis of his mental state, there remains a real possibility that he did kill himself. Following our analysis, the suicide hypothesis currently stands as the only cause of death that has objective evidence behind it. We cannot definitely rule out other theories of Poe's death, given the less consistent results from his professional writings, and that suicide is often influenced by numerous factors simultaneously. A more complex picture emerges. At the very least, his mounting depression could have played some role in his judgment and decision-making leading up to his death. Ultimately, the nature of Poe's death remains a mystery, quite befitting the master of the macabre. Poe's characterization as an uncontrollable alcoholic is disputed as well. His drinking companion for a time, Thomas Mayne Reid, admitted that the two engaged in wild frolics, but Poe never went beyond the innocent mirth in which we all indulge. While acknowledging this as one of Poe's failings, I can speak truly of it not being habitual. Some believe Poe had a severe susceptibility to alcohol and became drunk after one glass of wine. He only drank during difficult periods of his life and sometimes went several months at a time without alcohol. Adding further confusion about the frequency of Poe's use of alcohol was his membership in the Sons of Temperance at the time of his death. William Glenn, who administered Poe's pledge, wrote years later that the temperance community had no reason to believe that Poe had violated his pledge while in Richmond. Suggestions of a drug overdose have also been proven to be untrue, though it is still often reported. Thomas Dunn English, an admitted enemy of Poe and a trained physician, insisted that Poe was not a drug user. He wrote, "Had Poe the opium habit when I knew him before 1846, I should both as a physician and a man of observation have discovered it during his frequent visits to my rooms, my visits at his house, and our meetings elsewhere. I saw no signs of it and believed the charge to be a baseless slander." Poe's death, although untimely and unfortunate, was quite the fitting end for a writer who created stories of true horror and mystery. Even in death, Edgar Allan Poe created a mystery that would live on forever. Poe was buried in a cheap, unadorned wooden box on a cold and rainy day in a poorly attended ceremony. No one there, no one anywhere, knew exactly what had happened to put him there. But one jealous critic did know one thing. The strange and mysterious death of this dark and depressing genius was the perfect chance to make sure that his reputation ended up in the ground with him. Edgar Allan Poe is dead. He died in Baltimore the day before yesterday. This announcement will startle many, but few will be grieved by it. The poet was well known, personally or by reputation, in all this country. He had readers in England and in several of the states of continental Europe. But he had few or no friends, and the regrets for his death will be suggested principally by the consideration that in him literary art has lost one of its most brilliant but erratic stars. He was at times a dreamer, dwelling in ideal realms in heaven or hell, peopled with creations and the accidents of his brain. He walked the streets in madness or melancholy, with lips moving in indistinct curses, or with eyes upturned in passionate prayers for the happiness of those who at the moment were objects of his idolatry, but never for himself, for he felt or professed to feel that he was already damned. The History Expose website says in their article on Poe's death, readers of the Tribune read about the death of an insane man, the kind of man that you would expect to find ragged and incoherent shouting the name Reynolds. For years, this was how people remembered Poe, as a masterful writer whose morbid work was only a small window into the utter madness within. This is far from the whole truth, but as it turns out, Edgar Allan Poe wasn't exactly a popular figure in life, and his bizarre and mysterious death paved the way for a truly remarkable character assassination that convinced the world the price for his genius was sheer lunacy. Immediately after Poe's death, his literary rival, Rufus Griswold, wrote a slanted, high-profile obituary under a pseudonym filled with falsehoods that cast Poe as a lunatic and which described him as a person who walked the streets in madness or melancholy, with lips moving in indistinct curses, or with eyes upturned in passionate prayers, never for himself, for he felt or professed to feel that he was already damned. The long obituary appeared in the New York Tribune, signed Ludwig, on the day Poe was buried in Baltimore. It was further published throughout the country. The obituary began, Edgar Allan Poe is dead. He died in Baltimore the day before yesterday. This announcement will startle many, but few will be grieved by it. Ludwig was soon identified as Griswold, an editor, critic, and anthologist who had borne a grudge against Poe since 1842. History Expose continues. He may not be very well known today, something Poe would likely be delighted to hear, but the two men were quite well acquainted in life, and they hated each other's guts. It started when Poe publicly denounced an anthology of poetry that Griswold published. Griswold didn't take too kindly to the criticism, and from that point on, the two seemed to butt heads at every turn. Though to be fair, Poe butt heads with all kinds of people, including the famed Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Poe and Griswold couldn't seem to shake one another, competing over jobs and women, all while publicly trading jobs and editorial pieces. But when Poe died, Griswold saw an opportunity. His obituary, which, by the way, he stole from the novel The Claxton almost word for word, though nobody seemed to notice or care, hit the papers just 2 days after Poe's death. And just like that, the destruction of a great writer's legacy was underway. Griswold became Poe's literary executor, assumed by deceptive means as he simply convinced Poe's aunt and mother-in-law, Maria Clem, without any documentation, to sign control of Poe's writings and documents over to him. There is documentation to support this, though the absence of witness signatures and the question as to Clem having the authority, as Poe's sister Rosalie would have been his next of kin to be executor in such rights. Nevertheless, it was accepted, and Griswold put his plan into motion to assassinate his already dead enemy. He published several works that all attempted to destroy Poe's reputation after his death. Griswold wrote a biographical article on Poe called Memoir of the Author, where Maria Clem wrote the introduction, claiming that Mr. Griswold was publishing the book as a means to support Poe's surviving loved ones, although none of them ever received any payment or support of any form from Mr. Griswold. In Memoir, Griswold depicts Poe as a depraved, drunken, drug-addled madman, including some of Poe's letters as evidence. These were later determined to be forged. Many of his claims were either outright lies or obvious distortions. For example, there is little to no evidence that Edgar Allan Poe was a drug addict. Griswold's book was denounced by those who knew Poe well. Griswold's book, nevertheless, became a popularly accepted biographical source. This was in part because it was the only full biography available and was widely reprinted, and in part because readers are thrilled at the thought of reading works by an evil man. Poe's works weren't always appreciated in his time. He faced much criticism from the public and his literary peers at times, with many labeling him a madman due to his morbid themes. However, over time, his works grew in esteem, influencing writers like Charles Baudelaire, H.P. Lovecraft, and even modern-day authors like Stephen King. Despite the hardships Poe endured during his lifetime, his legacy has only grown since his death. Today, his works are not only central to the American literary canon, but they continue to inspire a wide range of adaptations, from movies and television shows to opera and graphic novels. Edgar Allan Poe's themes of madness, death, and the supernatural resonate even today, as audiences are still captivated by his chilling tales. And though his own life was riddled with tragedy, his words have inspired countless readers, artists, and writers around the world.
Nervous. Very, very dreadfully nervous. I had been and am, but why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. It is impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived, it haunted me day and night. Object there was none, passion there was none. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never given me insult. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. One of his eyes resembled that of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold. And so by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man and thus to rid myself of the eye forever. Now, this is the point. You fancy me mad. Madmen know nothing, but you should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded, with what caution, with what foresight. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him. And every night, about midnight, I turned the latch of his door and I opened it, oh, so gently. And then when I had made an opening sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern, all closed so that no light shone out. And then I thrust in my head. Oh, you would have laughed to see how cunningly I thrust it in. I moved it very slowly, very, very slowly, so that I might not disturb the old man's sleep. It took me an hour to place my whole head within the opening, so far that I could see him as he lay upon his bed. Now, would a madman have been so wise as this? And then, when my head was well in the room, I undid the lantern cautiously. Oh, so cautiously I undid it, just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye. This I did for 7 long nights, every night at midnight. But I found the eye always closed, and so it was impossible to do the work. For it was not the old man that vexed me, but his evil eye. And every morning when the day broke, I went boldly into the chamber and spoke courageously to him, calling him by name in a hearty tone and inquiring how he had passed the night. So you see, he would have been a very profound old man indeed to suspect that every night, just at 12, I looked in upon him while he slept. Upon the 8th night, I was more than usually cautious in opening the door. A watch's minute hand moves more quickly than did mine. Never before that night had I felt the extent of my own powers. I could scarcely contain my feelings of triumph. I had my head in the room and was about to open the lantern when my thumb slipped on the tin fastening and the old man sprang up in the bed crying out, "Who's there?" I kept quite still and said nothing. For a whole hour, I did not move a muscle. And in the meantime, I did not hear him lie down. He was still sitting up in the bed, listening. Presently, I heard a slight groan, and I knew it was the groan of long, drawn-out, mortal terror. It was not a groan of pain or of grief. Oh, no. No, it was the low, stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul. And overcharged with awe. I knew the sound well. Many a night, just at midnight, when all the world slept, it had welled up from my own bosom, deepening with its dreadful echo the terrors that distracted me. I say I knew it well. I knew what the old man felt, and I pitied him, although I chuckled at heart. I knew that he had been lying awake ever since the first slight noise when he had turned in the bed. His fears had been ever since growing upon him. He had been trying to fancy them causeless, but could not. He had been saying to himself, "It's nothing but the wind in the chimney. It's only a mouse crossing the floor. It is merely a cricket which has made a single chirp." Yes, he'd been trying to comfort himself with these suppositions, but he had found it all in vain, because death, in approaching him, had stalked with his black shadow before him and enveloped the victim. He felt the presence of my head within the room. When I had waited a long time, very patiently, without hearing him lie down, I resolved to open a very, very little crevice in the lantern. So I opened it, oh, you cannot imagine how stealthily, until at length a single dim ray, like the thread of a spider, shot from out the crevice and full upon the vulture eye. It was open, wide, wide open, and I grew furious as I gazed upon it. I saw it with perfect distinctness, all a dull blue, with a hideous veil over it that chilled the very marrow of my bones. But I could see nothing else of the old man's face or person, for I had directed the rays as if by instinct precisely on the damned spot. Now, have I not told you that what you mistake for madness is but over-acuteness of the senses? Now I say, there came to my ears a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I knew that sound well, too. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury as the beating of a drum stimulates the soldier to courage. But even yet I refrained and kept still. I scarcely breathed. Meantime, the hellish tattoo of the heart increased. It grew quicker and quicker and quicker and louder every instant. The old man's terror must have been extreme. It grew louder, I say, louder every moment. Do you mark me well? I have told you that I am nervous, so I am. And now, at the dead hour of the night, amid the dreadful silence of this old house, so strange a noise as this excited me to uncontrollable terror. Yet for some minutes longer, I refrained and stood still. But the beating grew louder and louder. I thought the heart must burst. And now, a new anxiety seized me. The sound would be heard by a neighbor. The old man's hour had come. With a loud yell, I threw the lantern and leapt into the room. He shrieked once, only once. In an instant, I dragged him to the floor and pulled a heavy bed over him. I then smiled gaily to find the deed so far done. For many minutes, the heart beat on with a muffled sound. Still, this did not vex me. It would not be heard through the wall, and then, at last, it ceased. The old man was dead. I removed the bed and examined the corpse. Yes, he was stone dead. I placed my hand upon the heart and held it there for many minutes. There was no pulsation. He was stone dead. His eye would trouble me no more. Now, if you still think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe the wise precautions I took for the concealment of the body. First, I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head, and then the arms and the legs. I then took up 3 planks from the flooring of the chamber, and I deposited all beneath the floor. I then replaced the boards so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out. No stain of any kind, no blood spot whatsoever. I had been too wary for that. A tub had caught it all. And then, when I had made an end of these labors, it was 4 o'clock. Still dark as midnight. As the bell sounded, there came a knocking at the street door. I went down to open it with a light heart, for what had I now to fear? There entered 3 men who introduced themselves with perfect suavity as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbor during the night. Suspicion of foul play had been aroused, and they, the officers, had been dispatched to search the premises. I smiled. For what had I to fear? I bade the gentleman welcome. The shriek, I said, was my own in a dream. The old man I mentioned was absent in the country. I took my visitors all over the house, and I bade them search and search well. I led them at length to his chamber. I showed them his treasures, secure, undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room and desired them here to rest from their fatigues, while I myself, in the wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. I was singularly at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted familiar things. But ere long, I felt myself getting pale, and I wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears, but still they sat and they chatted. The ringing became more distinct. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued and gained definitiveness until at length I found that the noise was not within my ears. It was a low, dull, quick sound, such a sound as a watch makes. Enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath. Yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, more vehemently, but the noise steadily increased. I arose and I argued about trifles, but the noise increased steadily. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by the observation of the men, but the noise steadily increased. Oh, God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore. I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting, grated it upon the boards, but the noise rose above all. It grew louder, louder, and still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible that they heard not? Oh, Almighty God, no, they heard. They suspected. They knew. They were making a mockery of my horror. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die. And now again, hark! Louder, 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 louder! Villains! Dissemble no more! I admit the deed! Tear up the planks! Here! It is the beating of his hideous heart!
Edgar Allan Poe's life was marked by unimaginable sorrow and hardship, yet his legacy endures, reminding us of the power of art to transcend suffering. His ability to face his demons and transform them into timeless tales is what makes Poe not only a master of the macabre, but also one of the most enduring figures in American literature. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the life of Edgar Allan Poe. Until next time, remember, all that we see or seem is but a dream within a dream, within a dream, within a dream, within